Welcome back to Rethinking Politics, episode 60. Today we're going to be talking about the rise of China. I've been surprised by how many people have discussed this in recent years, the influence China has over our economy, the influence that China has, and power that they have in the world as a major player in it. And on the surface, so much of their power makes perfect sense. And you can see why, because of trade deals, because of their massive population and their rising productivity and things, why presidents in the various, from both political parties have focused a lot on discussing trade deals with China, how they're robbing us or not robbing us, how they're manipulating currencies and things like that. I'm thinking back to is the first real election that I followed was when Mitt Romney was running. And ironically, it was Mitt Romney versus Obama, right? And this is back in 12 years ago, 13 years? I don't even remember the presidential election year. Some people can pull these off the top of their head because they're such a big thing, but were you going to say something?
I was going to say don't start speculating because it makes us look very ill-informed, Dan. Just say,
start searching for dates.
As soon as you ask the question, you realize that the answer doesn't matter. If you're asking the question, you don't know,
No, it's true of most tracking of dates and things. I feel bad for the high school students who are memorizing dates that they don't know the importance of and probably never will. And it wouldn't matter if they memorized them all, and even if they remembered them their whole life. Anyway, besides the point, China. One of the clearest examples of this in recent years is the NBA. The NBA and the influence China has on them is pretty straightforward. There is a growing population of fans of the NBA and of basketball in general in China. And so the NBA exports entertainment to China, and it's extremely profitable for them. And at that point, it becomes in their best interest to maintain that, to continue to make money if they want to grow and expand. You behave in ways that will keep China happy. And there's a strange thing here in that the way, if you have fans in some other country, the key is don't offend those fans. But if you're dealing with China, you have to not offend the Chinese government, because they will, in a heartbeat, cut you off from the fans. They will intervene, and they won't even think twice about it if there's something they don't like about it, in order to economically punish you for going against whatever it is that they stand for.
Yeah, I think a lot of people who are disturbed by how quick, the NBA will kowtow to China is not just that idea of people talk about cancel culture, which is what happens here in the US. If you say something that's politically incorrect, then your fans can turn on you, and you can get protested, and you can, get cut off from, your revenue source in that way. But what's happening with China is a little bit different, as Dan's saying, because China is not like the United States. All internet, all entertainment, everything that's moved into China, I wanted to say exported into China, is all heavily controlled by the Chinese government. I mean, particularly entertainment is directly controlled by the Chinese government. And so if you offend the Chinese government, that gets cut off, which means that you've got things like, who was it, John Cena, who publicly apologized for, I believe it was referring to Taiwan as a country.
Yes.
That was his grave travesty, and he apologized directly to China for it in order to maintain that relationship. I mean, the NBA is not the only one. I mean, Hollywood itself, has so many movie releases. We always talk about the US box office and the worldwide box office, but really it's, Asia is a huge part of that, and China is a huge part of Asia in terms of that revenue stream.
Yes, it's interesting. Entertainment is the most public of these. I think it's also the most dominant of these. I don't know how many other things we're importing into China. I mean, no doubt it's a ton. But in terms of places where where they're making so much money on it, I think entertainment is probably the big industry there that isn't being. Well, the Chinese industries aren't trying to compete with them in the same way. Right? I don't know how much of our steel China is importing. My guess would be almost zero. Right? It'd be very low. Rather, they're exporting lots of steel to the world. And the same with a lot of the manufactured goods. I don't expect that many Chinese people go shopping at the market and look for the American brand. They're like, oh, this was made in America. What does that mean?
Yeah.
Whereas it's utterly ordinary for us to be looking at a product and be like, made in China, to the point where that's not even a factor anymore because almost everything's made in China. There's so much of it's made in China. The effect the government has being able to so unilaterally pull the plug on things makes a big difference in the way that people try and control the message of their entertainment so that can sell in China. It's like if you had to modify a few words of what you were going to say in order to get another 50% income on whatever it is, or to, it seems like a very simple economic calculation for the entertainers and for the Hollywood elite, for the wrestling industry, apparently. I'm now imagining a big Chinese event with WWE wrestlers and just oh, WWE. It's a beautiful thing in its own way. But all of this makes for a lot of concern about the Chinese economy and about their power over us. And it's amplified by the fact that as you look at the increase in economic power of China, it's been a very rapid incline. And so people are like, well, at this rate, China is going to be the dominant market in the world, which means that this power is only going to grow until all of American businesses and all of American life is largely shaped by these same things that these entertainers are going through, the same filter. And that's a world that a lot of people don't like, because it ultimately would mean China controls the culture. If they can control the entertainment, they can control the words you say and don't say. They can control, even to some degree, higher education by the students that they send and where they allow them to go and those kind of things. So much of our things can be through mere finances, through mere economics.
No, and a great example of that is what the U.S. has done over the last 60 years. The U.S., economically and financially was the superpower, and because of that became the cultural center of the world for a long time. And that had huge effects on almost every other country in the world. Every other country in the world has been affected by the United States, and that's very real, even though they weren't necessarily militarily affected by us, even though some were. But for the most part, the most part, our economic dominance did result in some kind of cultural dominance. And now people are coming to terms with the fact that, number one, we are losing that economic dominance and therefore the cultural one, and China looks like it could be the replacement, the next economic superpower that then becomes the cultural power.
Right. That we'd be getting their values and their morals and things, whether we wanted to or not, just based on the way it works when you're the economic superpower. Yeah, and it makes sense. I think it's a reasonable thing to be concerned about, the idea that the most prosperous countries have a massive sway over less prosperous countries, and that's just the way it is. For better or worse, that's how it works. And this is the kind of problem that you see Joe Biden rewinding to his campaigning and things, when he's calling for unity, when he's calling for a united front. And a large part of that, and we were surprised by this. I remember when we were talking about this with the back when they were doing the where the Democratic Party appointed him and as a representative, what's the word I'm looking for?
The DNC.
The DNC, yeah, the Democratic National Convention. How focused it was on China. That was surprising rhetoric for me coming from Joe Biden. But there was a reason
surprising
for that.
because it didn't differentiate himself very much from Trump, because
Right.
Trump was very similar in his opposition to China.
Yeah, it sounded like Trump or the Mitt Romney I mentioned some years before. It's odd. But the rhetoric went something like this. You have these, because of because of the absolute power, in the technical sense, of the Chinese government. They can decide what happens, and it happens. They can pull the plug on something. And if you have their ear, you can get in. You have to go through them. Their absolute control of their economy. Because of that, they have some advantage in competing economically in the world that we don't have, that can only be countered by us unifying. They can only be countered by us getting together with a shared vision of the future and uniting behind it, so that the natural advantages of an absolute government could be nullified by us having the same virtues but being a democracy. Right? We could do the same things an absolute government could if we could just unite. And that would involve looking into the future and planning ahead. And this is still the rhetoric of the infrastructure bill that's going through right now.
Mm-hmm.
And making the wise decisions for the American future so that we're still the most competitive economy for decades to come. And that requires this investment, that requires this planning and this moving forward together in a way that's very hard to do in democracy, but is very easy for a dictator to do. Very easy for someone where the power is centralized. This is what I want, so we do it.
Yeah, and that line has a lot of weight, because we've been told, and we've come to believe for a long time now, that there are many areas of progress and development that are just easier to do when it's done by government. We talk about, a great example is looking at things like the space race, where it's something that no one else could have done, definitely not in that time frame, and all the technological advancements that were accomplished as we were unified in that goal, that never would have been possible in the private sector, but we were able to accomplish as a people. And infrastructure is another one. We've always believed that the only way you can have truly effective infrastructure, whether it's roads or power or any other major infrastructure, it has to be done on a government level. And so you need government to be efficient and effective and quick in doing those kinds of things. And you're right, that is what Biden's trying to do with his infrastructure. And he's talked about that, about how part of it is to compete with the rest of the world, that he wants us to be a new and improved United States economic power. And the way to do that is through government action, through unified action, which are, of course, synonymous.
Yeah, yes. When we work together, what it looks like actually is that those who are not interested in doing it are compelled. This is the modern doublethink of unified action. But that aside, you can see why that argument might be appealing. You look at China and you look at their things like speed rail and things in other countries, and this tends to really impress people. And they look at that and they go, "Why don't we have that?" And it's really simple. Because the private interests are not sufficient to build it. So you need a unified government. You need a government action to come in and to make it happen. And the idea is that this is clearly going to be better. This is the thing of the future, and you need some kind of body that can make that happen for the good of all of us in the long run.
Because the short-term economic benefits may not be enough to justify. Well, we know they're not enough to justify private sector action,
right?
Because otherwise it would already be done.
Yes. So you have and this goes to a deeper story about economics that is just so common, and it goes something like this: you have, on the one hand, you have capitalists who, maybe for all their faults, are good at least in the short term. their greed is useful in many cases to get them to do the right thing. But as soon as you are looking out over the horizon beyond 5 or 10 years and you're looking at what's going to come in the generations ahead, their short-term profit motives are insufficient. And perhaps there's even, a lot of people will say they're insufficient from the beginning. but I'm the most generous reading, right, of capitalism from this perspective is to say, sure, it's sufficient in some circumstances, but for long-term planning, it's not. And the rail is the perfect example of why that is. They can't see the short-term benefit of it. Thus, it's not going to happen. And thus, when we need it, or as we're developing into it and things, we're not going to have it.
Yeah, and I would say even beyond rail, public transit in general is the ultimate example of that, right?
Yes, you're right.
That it's something that's almost never executed on the private sector. That is almost always publicly funded, and it's almost always universally seen as a huge financial and economic advantage to have that kind of system in place.
Yes, and part of, to some degree, it seems like China has accepted that story that I just presented, even to the point of saying markets are useful to some degree. They've, in recent, 20, 30 years, they've done a lot to open up their economy to be more of a market economy at some levels.
Well, and China, because China is coming from a very different place than the United States is coming from. The United States is coming from a place that says markets are the ultimate good. But over the last years, we've realized, there are some problems with capitalism and maybe we should have more government action, is at least the general narrative that's being told. Mm-hmm. China, at least ever since Mao and his Cultural Revolution, has been in a very different place and has never had to has never had to say, hey, we need government action. We need government to do things. No, it's been a government first nation for so long and so much of it has been government controlled. After the Cultural Revolution, there were government instructions on what people were going to be planting and what people were going to be doing and direct government control of the economy. And so for China, it's not, hey, I think public transit should be government controlled. It's, hey, I think there are a few areas of capitalism that we are going to allow in this country in order to benefit, but we're going to be very careful about how many of those things there are. But in general, the government is going to maintain control.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Maybe in this case, we should allow something because it might work out a little better. But that's not.
But government control is the default, not the new idea.
Right. Well, it's interesting. You mentioned the free market tendency in the U.S. and certainly more so. Like, people don't realize this. I think that's more so the case than perhaps anywhere else in the world. And why that is strange. Like even European countries don't have that. Places
that cultural belief, yeah.
That cultural belief in market action. It's just, It was never really there. France is a good example of a European country in which we share many values and draw a lot from their history and philosophers. And I often quote Bastiat, clearly a Frenchman. And the French classical economists are the beginning of where our economic ideas come from. And they're developed later through and it turns into the Austrian school and different things. But there's so much, partially because they were the economic superpower that was dominant culturally for a long period of time. France has a lot to offer the world. But they don't share those assumptions. They don't share that tendency. And that tendency, I think, in the U.S. only came about because of its history of being a colony in which the other countries were like, we need to go and we colonize America and we're going to get wealthy off of it. There's a part of that story that people don't realize, which is that it didn't work at all like they thought it would. Right? They would create these colonies, they get these people over there, and it turns out not only is it not profitable, it's a money pit. You're throwing money into it, and you're getting nothing in return. There's no easy gold, there's no Pocahontas right? Pocahontas for the going is
I got it.
truly a cartoon version of this, but it's also a decent reflection of what they were hoping for. And so the British government especially was like, you know what, you guys just do your own thing because it doesn't help us at all to control you or to try and get anything out of you. There's nothing to get yet. And it's many, many decades, and really more like a century before even trade is that profitable with with the colonies in the US. And anyway, all of that gives us a very different cultural look because the governments left them alone. Because it wasn't beneficial for the government to control them because they were so poor, because they were so far away and so poor. But like you were saying, China is not at all like that. There's none of those assumptions, none of those ideas, none of the things that go into that. And as such, there's so much there that it's difficult to read events in China and to interpret them. It's really difficult to know what's happening because from the ground up, it's different.
Mm-hmm.
We even the private-ish businesses that we look at now don't operate by the same rules. They're not playing with the same incentives. And little incentives, as we've shown over and over again, make a huge difference. And the incentives are different from the ground up. Who you have to please is different from the ground up. How a business functions there is different from the ground up. Because you exist by the leave and often with the direct support of the Chinese party, the Communist Party there. And that changes everything. Which brings us to a look at the Chinese economy as it is. Not as we fear that it could be, but as it actually is.
What's happening on the floor right now.
Yes, and it's
with the information that we can find.
With the information,
because it's also complicated by the fact that government control of the media in China is very strong.
Yeah,
and so that means that the information we're getting is what they're willing to share with us. You know, if that's anything you've picked up with the rise of COVID in the last 2 years, is that China only tells the rest of the world what China wants to tell the rest of the world. And you have to take that with a grain of salt because it is on message. And I mean, if you look at the United States, if you only listened to what the White House was saying about COVID over the last 2 years, how much of that would be inaccurate, especially, you know, because so many of the things they say have contradicted each other, you know, over the months and years. It hasn't been consistent. Sorry, I'm not speaking clearly, but if you took that and said this is the only narrative coming out of the US, you wouldn't have a clear picture of what was happening in the US. Yeah. You have to look at other sources than just the official government one. So when you're looking at China, even though you're reading from these Chinese, you know, media sources, you have to picture it like that. Like, this is just the government narrative for the most part. And so what are the other narratives that we're not seeing, just as if we only heard the official U.S. government narrative and not any other narrative?
Yeah, and we could really get into the weeds of the comparisons of the central planners that began really in the U.S. in the early 1900s, really at the turn of the century there. And how they addressed the changing economy in the U.S. and how that reflected in a lot of ways how they felt about places like Russia and later on China. To me, it's a extremely interesting topic because somewhere in there were a lot of arguments that needed to be made that weren't, that would have deflected a lot of America's course that led to things like the agencies we discussed in the last episode. And their power to control a lot of significant portions of the economy, or at least to dictate the direction of it. China, one of the best, or one of the most useful ways, I think, to think of the rise of China is to think of what we were thinking, to look at how people felt about Russia when it was rising. Right? The fear was that Russia would become what we think China is going to become. Now, China obviously has a few advantages that Russia doesn't, namely a massive population.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But Russia rose in power and was exporting its influence around the world And the Cold War was often us fighting the Russian influence, right? The cultural influences of Russia. And we feared that they were going to take our place. I mean, I guess America at that point was itself the new kind of superpower, really risen to its undisputed place there post World War II. Though it had been influential for some time before that, it was at that point dominant.
But the important thing was that Russia's rise was really inevitable unless the U.S. did something to stop it.
Yes, and that's how people viewed it, and that's why you get a lot of what Reagan did in directly contesting the spread of Russian influence in other states, and by states I mean countries in other countries, and pushing them, trying to limit the spread of the Soviet Union and so on.
And of course, the history of that is clouded by the threat of nuclear war.
Yes.
But the reality of the Cold War is that was only one part of it. And in many ways, it was a very propagandized part of it that helped the U.S. in its narrative in convincing people that the Cold War was justified, was that threat. Because when you talk about vague things like economic or cultural dominance, it's not nearly as catchy as you are going to be vaporized in an instant along with every single person that you know and love. It just doesn't have the same ring.
Dark and cover. Yeah.
But in reality, most of the U.S. and Russia's fight was not, I mean, obviously it wasn't a nuclear one, but it wasn't even about a nuclear one. I mean, you've got the Cuban Missile Crisis and some other incidents, but even the nuclear war and the positioning of nukes was a red herring. That the real game was the economic one, was the cultural one.
Yes.
In many, many ways.
Yes, and at that time, a lot of the arguments that Biden is making now were made about what the U.S. should do to respond to it. Look at the natural advantages that the authoritarian institutions of the Soviet Union give them. They're united in ways that we're not, and that it's very difficult for democracy to be. We need to institute planning and all kinds of other things that will help us stay competitive in the changing world. This, especially during World War II, was just crazy for this, from price controls and all kinds of other things. The reality is, and this is making a very long story short, there was no hope of Russia ever becoming dominant.
Well, a great example of this, the way I like to tell this story, Dan, is, Russia was on the rise, and its rise was inevitable, which is why, at the end of the 1980s, the U.S. invaded Russia and finally put a stop to it, and that's why Russia fell. There are going to
be some people going and telling their teachers very confused things after that statement.
because how the Cold War is told is there's this huge struggle, through careful fights on very small locations, through strategically, taking over these small countries, and then after asking Gorbachev to tear down the wall, the U.S. caused the Soviet Union to fall.
Yeah, it culminates with this moral moment. This after all these victories, we come, and the final triumph is a moral or spiritual one.
Yes,
there.
And that speech was rhetoric to the ultimate degree, because that speech had no effect on policy. Everything that was in motion in Russia was already in motion at that point. Everything that happened in Russia after that speech was a result of things at that point that were 20, 30, 40 years old. They just took so long to
play out. Yeah.
To play out, exactly. That his speech had nothing to do with that. That the U.S.'s maneuverings, for the most part, really had nothing to do with that. That what happened to the Soviet Union was that it decayed from the inside out because of how it was set up. And that was almost inevitable.
Right. Unless they change something, right? They continue doing what they're doing, and it's going to collapse.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what we're talking about is not some kind of moral inevitability. We're talking economic inevitability.
We're talking physical realities of the world.
The physical realities of doing things cost stuff. And if the cost is greater than the benefits and things, you end up you can act in a way that ends up destroying your productive capacities. And that's precisely what we talk about when we talk about things like the way that people imagine taxing billionaires does not harm the billionaire. What it does is it harms the enterprises that they're running. And that may or may not cause economic collapse per se, but you apply the kind of thinking where every time you look to the economy, you try and you attack the successful people in ways that end up hurting the productive enterprises. It ends up the next year you are less prosperous because you've got less production, and that should be intuitive. They behaved in so many ways where they did that over and over and over again, including things like punishing successful people, and they killed off a lot of the most successful farmers in an area because those were richer, right? They were the rich class. Mm-hmm. You kill the higher class, or you punish them in different ways. You move them to different positions.
Send them to the gulag.
You send them to the gulag, and it turns out next year, when you replace them with other people, they don't grow as much food. Mm-hmm. And that should be no surprise to anyone. But they thought that they could plan so much, and they had this vision of the future, and they were looking at the future. To be fair to them, they were trying.
Yeah, they were planning. They weren't just messing around. You had serious invested central planners.
Yes. And the result is they end up destroying their own wealth and becoming less and less powerful and less influential. Stalling, at the very least, they're destroying enough that they're not getting wealthy nearly as fast as other countries are, which means their influence in the long run deteriorates. Yet, somehow, I hear podcast after podcast, I hear speaker after speaker, article after article talking about the rise of China. As if China somehow has conquered those economic laws, found a blend of capitalism and socialism that works effectively, and which will now lead them into the glorious new age that will allow them to surpass us. And to be fair, there's more merit to that than when we were thinking that was what was going to happen with Russia. Again, with Russia, one of the problems was we had such bad information. We had no idea what was happening outside of very carefully controlled areas that made it look like things were way better than they were. They had cities that you could go visit, that they would let internationals come and visit, where everything looked like it was perfectly fine and functional.
Yeah, but it was a lie.
It was a show, right?
It's something that we see today with North Korea. Everyone's aware.
Yeah,
if you can take a tour bus through North Korea, and you'll be looking at these pretty shops and these beautiful streets, but no one in North Korea actually lives on those streets. It is a show like a street in Hollywood just for the tourists.
Yes,
and the rest of the country is nothing like that.
I'm sure this is myth. It may be true, but I remember hearing about this as if it was true. But it makes the point, true or not, that the Russians made a propaganda film where they went to like the Bronx in New York and looked at very poor areas and showed it to the people, saying this is what it's like
this is the U.S.
in a market. Yes, and the people were like, "Oh my goodness, they all have TVs. Look at that." And then it ended up backfiring because of something so commonplace in the U.S. that was just a luxury there. Yeah. Unimaginable luxury. Just so far out of reach of the average person. That sounds like
a myth, but it sounds like a good one.
Yeah.
Because when you said that, my initial thought was, oh man, yeah, if you take the worst of the United States, they're going to be like, yeah, that's awful. But no. That we're so used to our level of economic prosperity that we do think of the worst places in the United States as being truly awful, but it was better than Soviet-era Russia.
Right, and if you tried that now, what people would say is like, oh my gosh, they all have phones, right? They all have, look at it. Most of them have a car. It may be a garbage car, but most of them have a car. Like this is we take for granted the capacity of the market to take luxuries and make them commonplace. It's astounding. It raises us above the wealth level of billionaires from just mere decades ago. makes your life better in so many ways than there's ever could have been with all the money in the world.
But back to China.
Back to China.
And so first of all, everyone knows that China is not that different from Russia and how it started.
No.
I mean, you've got the Cultural Revolution, you've got Mao, you've got and here once again we've got an information problem. But the number of people who died after the Cultural Revolution, and a huge portion of those who died were not killed. And this is really important. They died due to starvation because of the economic central planning that was done after the Cultural Revolution. So you had the Cultural Revolution, you had direct government control of basically all of the means of production.
Mm-hmm.
And they came up with plans. They sent people to the fields to produce this and this a crop and produce this and this. And one of the things they did is they were centrally planning. They were looking to the future, and they said, what we need is an industrial revolution here in China. We are agricultural. We need an industrial revolution. And so they sent the peasants who were working in the farms to go and start producing metal, to start producing steel and other metals.
That's what happened in other countries. They left the farms, they go to the cities. They
saw where the future was going to take them, and they thought they'd just go there. And an estimated 40 million people died over a certain number of years. And the numbers vary. And it could be as low as 20 million, could be as high as 60 million. But the fact of the matter is that far more people died in China than Hitler ever killed in a concentration camp. And it wasn't, and so many of those deaths were unintentional. They were just a byproduct of that central planning. And everyone forgets that is the origin of modern day Chinese government. That today's Chinese government has seen a few iterations, but that is the foundation upon which it is built.
Right. And it's a foundation of central planning where trying to plan for the future led them to massive amounts of deaths. I don't want to spend too much time on this. As a side note to the central planning of the visionary socialists and such, for every Lenin and Stalin and Mao with great dreams of the future for their people, there are a ton of bureaucrats involved in the decisions and low-level leaders who do not have long-term interests in heart any more than anyone else does. They're just getting by underneath the hub of what appears to be a unified government power with absolute authority. You have 1,000 little spider webs of people with short-term interests that are just playing out as usual. Mm-hmm. They haven't somehow transcended human nature, and nor does their centralization of power somehow limit the effect of short-term interests on long-term wisdom. That's that whole idea that central planning has somehow conquered that, even if central planning worked, is false. There's so many short-term decisions. It's why corruption in these states is absolutely rampant. Right? The planning doesn't work, and so you get by through a lot of corruption. You get by. I remember a mutual friend of ours taught a class to us who talked about when he lived in Russia how the total taxes he was expected to pay was over 100%. It's like just if you go by the laws, you make zero money, which is a problem if people assumed you would live by the laws. But everyone knows that that's how it works, and so you don't pay that actual amount. But there's a particular business there in China that is Well,
before you talk about Evergrande, Dan.
Yeah, Evergrande is in the news. A lot of you have probably heard about it. Well, maybe.
I want to preface why we're going to talk about it because the answer to my statement about central planning, to your statement about central planning, to your statement about Russia, is, as you were saying, that China learned its lesson after 40 million people died. And mm-hmm. What they did is they combined all the best things about having a strong government and they combined all the best things about having a free market, and they put them together in this hybrid that is at once incredibly efficient because they have that strong government that can put in infrastructure, that can set things up to allow for the market that they do have to then be incredibly efficient and profitable. And that's how you have the modern day China that we have now, which is this economic juggernaut because you've got all these people who are able to produce, and they're allowed to produce by their government and allowed to make some decisions, while also having this strong government that supports that market through through that unity.
Yes, and can help them compete with the world at large, and
more effectively by acting as one at times, while at other times allowing the businesses to act themselves.
Mhm.
That's the narrative that we're being told now. That's why China, or at least a large part of why China is so effective, and that's why we need unity on our end. We don't need to get rid of the market, but we need to unify it in many different areas in order to compete. And so we want to answer that concern. Specifically, not just what's wrong with central planning, but what's wrong with this hybrid.
Yes, what's wrong with the hybrid, and why? And have they done what they claim they have done, and what often we act as if they have done? Evergrande is a conglomerate that is focused on construction, but like all conglomerates, it now does a million things. And it's a business enterprise there in China. With the rise of the Chinese economy, and with it growing so rapidly, it's only natural that a lot of American investing, if you want to make a profit and the international market a good place, or so the wisdom has been, the word on the street is you invest, one of the places you should invest is in the Chinese economy, and specifically in their construction. They have a massive population.
Yeah, real estate. The
real estate, right. They need to house this population. They're going to be building a lot, the cities and apartments and houses and whatnot. And certainly that's been the dream of the Chinese citizen, is to actually own some property to the degree that owning property is a thing in China. It's very difficult. And so a lot of the funding and a lot of what you'll find if you read articles about Evergrande is talking about how the Chinese citizens, they'll get their intergenerational families, right, living in a very small space generally, and they will save and save and save so that they can put in a deposit, some set amount of money that they pay a company like Evergrande, that then guarantees them it's the beginning of paying for an apartment that will be constructed later, and perhaps even a house. I think it's almost always apartments, but perhaps houses are included here too.
I mean, it's very urban.
Yes. And so Evergrande is what you imagine already, right? Is you have people who want a building, a place to stay, and you have a business. And our presuppositions as Americans, or as not communists, as not Chinese, we already have in your head several assumptions here about the way this is working that are almost undoubtedly wrong. Right? And this is the problem that we keep running to with the articles, and what Brad was saying about information, is that all of these articles tell a basically similar story about Evergrande. It has $300 billion US worth of debt.
Yeah, of liabilities of some sort.
Liabilities, yes. And so it looks like it's going to collapse. Which is a massive
amount. Which is such a massive amount.
We were talking about there are only a small group of countries in the world where a business could begin to approach that number. And even if you were looking at governments themselves, that's a massive amount of money. It's a third of $1 trillion in a lot of government economies. If you had that kind, you'd be like, oh, this is collapsing. This is the currency is collapsing. They have $300 billion in US debt, the equivalent of it. And people look at this and they go, okay, it has that kind of debt. Here's its business model. It's paid money. It then gets property and constructs things down the road. And right now there's tons of money wrapped up in it. And these people, if this business goes under, supposedly these people, presumably, they're not getting their money back. I'm not sure what. Again, that's an assumption. We don't know how the businesses work actually in China. What this means. In the U.S., if it declares bankruptcy, you may lose your investment. You may lose the money that you paid them. They declare bankruptcy, and there's nothing you can do about it. There's a limit to how much money they're liable for because they're a corporation, which protects them from some of what is the natural law consequences of actions. And anyway,
but all of those laws are a Western and primarily a U.S. system. And so it doesn't. I mean, applying them here is not going to help us understand.
Yes, which is the difficulty of this. Is we're looking at this. So there's lots of American money wrapped up in this business, and people are looking at it as perhaps the beginning of a bubble popping in China, akin to the 2008 bubble that popped in the U.S., where the housing market just crashed. Right? You had they're comparing to, is it the Lehman Brothers, which was kind of the first big company that went under that propelled a lot of the 2008 stuff. And then you get the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac that we talk about, and you get government prop-ups. And so people are looking at it and they're like, is the Chinese government going to prop them up? And you get mixed opinions on that. A lot of people that I've read, a lot of the articles out there from your basic financial institutions and banks say, yes, you've got to prop this up. Think of all the people that are going to be hurt. Think of all the jobs that are going to be lost. Why wouldn't you prop this up is kind of the assumption. And it's just strange to read about because all of the important pieces are unknown. There are a few things we do know. That the way that a company determines whether or not they should make long-term investments is largely dictated by by things like the interest rate.
Mm-hmm.
And in Western countries, we have a major problem because the Federal Reserves tamper with the interest rate all the time, which is the signal of the supply and demand for long-term investment, which means if a lot of people are saving so that they can buy a house, the interest rate should be naturally low because there's a lot of resources available because they're not consuming things, right? They're saving. Mm-hmm. So there's more market resources for investment. And that's a wonderful thing to have. You have the saving of some, the investment of others, and then that saving is paid off by them taking control of that investment later, right? And this makes perfect sense. If I'm not consuming, I'm saving, then that can lead to more investment in other places. But we try and do both at the same time. We try and consume and save. We want lots of investments, but we want high consumption. and the result is that investments begin in places where there is no corollary saving. And there are massive problems.
Yeah, because the thing with Evergrande, the reason it's struggling is because it's got all of this debt, but so many companies have debt. That's not really the problem.
Right.
The problem is that debt is being used on projects that are not profitable, that are not producing revenue streams that then pay back the debt. You know, basically how it works is Evergrande will spend ridiculous amounts of money, like billions of dollars, on a massive project, creating huge apartments, skyscrapers, they got a stadium, an artificial island. It's ridiculous. But anyways, they'll create these giant projects and they'll have a bunch of them in the works. They'll finish the projects and they'll sell it or they'll lease it and they'll get, and usually when you sell it, you get this huge amount of cash flow that then can go to pay off the debt you got in order to fund the project and have profit on top of that. What's happening though is that Evergrande has all these projects in the works, and they're not nearly as profitable as Evergrande thought they would be. And so if you have several projects that you spent $1.5 billion on, and they're not even going to bring back $1.5 billion, maybe you can't even sell them right now, and it's being delayed and slowed down, and the market's changed in ways you didn't expect, and now you've got all of these projects that aren't producing revenue, but that still cost you all of this money. And that's when you get in trouble. I mean, Evergrande specifically has interest payments on debt that they haven't been able to meet. They're struggling to even keep a lid on their debt because it's gotten so bad. But that's because of their inability to be profitable. And that's really, I mean, there's a few reasons that could be. One, they made really poor decisions. One, they're mismanaged in many different ways. Or the other option is that they have been unable to accurately predict where the market would go. And that's worth noting because that's something we shouldn't see in a government stabilized unified system that China promises to be. That's what we always argue is happening here in, the wild west of capitalism, is that people can't accurately predict what's going to happen, and that causes loss. But no, what we're saying here is in this government controlled system, it's not a little bit off, it's so incredibly off that Evergrande is losing money hand over fist because of that. One of the big things in China is that there's been a huge real estate boom for a very long time in China, and I think that is actually starting to catch up with China, that they're going to have too much real estate, and that bubble is going to pop, and Evergrande may just be the tip of that iceberg.
Yes.
And you're going to see much more of that. And Dan, I know you have the answer for at least part of why that real estate bubble is about to pop, and it has to do with population.
It does have to do with population. Well, what you're saying about profitability is so intuitive, that if you look at a construction company that was a small construction company building houses, you'd say, they would get a client who wants them to build a house and would pay them to build a house, and they'd negotiate a price that works for both of them. And then they would build it, right? They'd build it and they'd get paid, and assuming that everything works normally, things are great. Of course, if you want to make more money, what you do is you get ahead of it. You don't build on demand, you build ahead of the demand. Or in anticipation of the demand. We say, well, look, lots of people want these kind of houses. We expect that because of the influx of people coming, different things, that's going to stay there, so that if we start a project that takes us a year to finish, it will be wanted at some point in that process, and we'll make money off it. You start to predict the needs. This is, in a nutshell, the art of what it means to be an entrepreneur and what it means to run a business and to create something like that. You're not just satisfying the needs of customers for a fee, but you're anticipating them if you want to be really successful and ahead of the game. And you use all kinds of data to make that assessment, depending on the scale of what you're doing. So if you're going to build like an apartment complex or a skyscraper worth of apartments, as is often the case in some of these high-rise apartments in China, right? The reliability of the information you have is really important. And what you need to know is the supply and demand as it is, and all kinds of things about the people moving in. And I mean, if I knew all the things you need to know, I wouldn't be doing this podcast. I'd be building skyscrapers and making a fortune, right?
Not anymore.
Or not. This is the art that they're engaging in. And this is the skills that they would need at the highest level to manage this company. I saw an estimate that there are 80 to 90 million more apartments than there is demand for in China. That's so far off. We watched a video and we found on an article that showed 15 skyscrapers that they weren't finished, but we're not sure what exactly that entailed, but there are 15 skyscrapers in this area together. Next to each other.
They're probably like 20 to 30 stories. They're small skyscrapers, but they're those super high-rise apartments, so they're big apartment buildings.
They had been built as part of this city project, and no doubt the cities play a extremely important role in this that they don't play in the U.S., that we have no idea what it is, and the articles don't even seem to realize would be an important aspect of it. And there are these 15 skyscrapers. The outside looks like it's done. We can't tell if there are windows, and there's still probably a lot of work.
The structure is
complete.
The structure
at least is complete. They've sat there for 8 years. They realize now they will never be used, and they're demolishing them. You watch them all get demolished at the same time. They all kind of collapse in. There are cities,
which is crazy.
There are cities there in China that were built based on planned things where the whole city is finished. You've got shopping malls, buildings, again, more skyscrapers and things. And it could hold many millions of people, and there are 150,000 people there. It's almost like a ghost town, but it's brand new. This is what central planning looks like. This is what it's always looked like. This is what happens when because the way that Brad was talking about the hybrid, it's got the market, the benefits of the market, and the benefit of centralization. Well, how do you direct the market elements? You control the signals. You control the information so that they make the choices that line up with your vision of the future. As I said, the West does this with the Federal Reserve. It's the one area where it's almost universally accepted. It shouldn't be. It messes all kinds of things up. You tamper with those numbers so that they act according to your script and build in the direction that you have determined is wise. And that is truly the only way you get people building a skyscraper full of apartments when there are millions and millions, tens of millions of apartments already open that can't be filled. China may be the future, but if it's the future, it will be because America started central planning too.
I was about to say all of this is not to demonstrate how the U.S. is better than China.
It's not.
All of this is to demonstrate what we've been very clear about in discussing, the U.S. economy, which is that this hybrid is not a reasonable solution. We've talked about, what people call crony capitalism and this government capitalism mix in the past, specifically about the U.S.
Yeah.
And the same problems we've had in the US, they're having over there in China. That yes, this hybrid system is a lot better than ordering all the Chinese peasants to go produce steel instead of food. Obviously this is better, but to argue that this is better than the free market is horribly incorrect. A great example of that is Hong Kong. Hong Kong, for the longest time, was allowed true economic freedom, and they used that to become this hub of productivity and wealth, massive amounts of wealth that were produced that China took advantage of and was much, much more successful than mainland China, even though it was, partially controlled by China. But it was almost like this experiment in free market that China did. And now in recent years, China has been cracking down on Hong Kong and limiting Hong Kong and limiting its productivity through government intervention. And as they've been doing that, Hong Kong has not become more profitable and more successful. It's become less so. That's inevitable.
You're right.
And to argue the opposite is simply to ignore the facts, is to twist the facts, is to obfuscate what's actually going on.
Right.
Which China does a lot.
Right, which China does. Yes, I remember reading the articles we read from them about the news of the UN summit and what happened in the US's hypocrisy, and it's such propaganda. And anyway, and we haven't even mentioned, we focused on the central planning aspect. They have serious demographic issues, also caused by their central planning. They are approaching a point where like us, they will have extremely few workers relative to the number of old and retired people. And again, I don't know what retiring looks like in China. Do you get to do that there? Whatever the case, their healthcare is going to take up more and more of their finances in major ways, and their population is going to top out. If you were to say who's going to be the future, China or India, I would say India, and it's not a question. It's not like of those two, if one of them is going to emerge, right now it'll be India, unless China changes all kinds of things. I think China will actually decline in the near future. At the very least, their rate of increase is going to slow to the point where they're growing slower than we're growing, right? The distance between us is going to increase.
Yeah, to put it simply, when people are comparing China to Russia during the Cold War, we agree with that assessment.
Yes.
That just like that, it's going to be used by the United States as an excuse for all sorts of government action. And just like that, what we're looking at right now with China is not an inevitable rise, but really China at its peak. That China over the next 20 years, this is its peak. 40 years from now, China will be less powerful than it is now.
Yes.
Just like you could say the same thing basically at any point during the Cold War for the Soviet Union.
Yes.
That given time, it doesn't necessarily have to collapse, but it's not going to be the same level of power because it's inevitable.
Yeah.
As long as they keep using the systems that they are, and there's almost no way that China's going to change with how tightly controlled the government is.
Yes, how you change it once it gets to that point without like a straight up, I don't know. That's a topic for another time. I agree with you. I don't think it's going to change. I don't think it's going to change. It's so interesting. And you hear, again, reading the articles about it, the way that they emphasize it, they use Keynesian economics, which I think is fundamentally flawed. But even then, they assume so much about the relationship between the income of the business and its costs. I don't know. So much of that, all of the land is owned by the state. All of it. Which means that even in the level of land acquisition, the costs and things are going to be politically motivated in ways that are unpredictable and make running a business a political game rather than a game of predicting the needs of the people and anticipating the costs. You're not rewarding entrepreneurship in whatever game they're playing there. You're rewarding sycophancy. You're rewarding political favorites. And that their construction industry is typified by this. This is the worst case of them, this Evergrande. I was like, Evergarden? Evergarde? Evergrande is in the worst shape. But of course you're going to see a price collapse. Or at least you will if they allow it. I don't know how many of the prices they're literally fixing, right? Which is just going to lead to more bad investment. If you set the price of something that should be lower or higher, what you're doing is you're saying it's more valuable than the people think it is, which means the people are going to get less than this than they want, or more of it than they want. Right? It doesn't reflect the reality of what the people are interested in. And only supply and demand can do that naturally, left alone without any tampering of the numbers. Nothing else generates that data. At least until we have mind-reading AI.
No, and that is always the problem with central planning, is that no matter how well-intentioned it is, and you can argue, of course, about how well-intentioned it can never be.
Yes.
And to argue that the PRC is a benevolent dictator is just ludicrous.
But it's a funny thought.
But on top of that is the never-ending fact that they are just not going to be able to predict the future more effectively than the ultimate computing power that is millions and millions of individuals making decisions based off of their own personal economic incentives. That we've never seen a supercomputer that can come even close to the computing power of the human brain, especially when you look at the human brain working in tandem with every other human brain in the country. And that's something that the central planners have never been able to understand. That when we talk about the free market, we're not talking about some fanciful belief in an invisible hand. What we're talking about is the fact that when you align incentives for each individual, that they will benefit by being productive, and that they will lose out if they're not productive. What happens is those people get productive in ways that no one could have planned and no one could even have predicted.
Right.
And that's the power of that it's almost a hive mind. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about the free market. We're talking about this hive mind that is this supercomputer made up of millions and millions of individuals who are all acting in this incredible harmony with each other that you would never believe possible if you hadn't seen it.
Yeah, a harmony to the degree you stop crime, right? They will attempt not to do it inharmoniously. They'll attempt to do it at each other's expense, and that's what you stop. That's what needs to be prevented. So that the only route is through harmony, right? And the government is
in so many cases today. What we see is people using the government as an instrument of force.
There's no harmony here. Process. Yes. So I will impose my will across many that are unwilling. Yeah, it's. I like the way you put it there in terms of processing power. People, because you're right, people don't think of it that way. What they think of it is, do I want the smart guy or the dumb guy? Right? They put it 1-to-1. The reality is,
ratio.
You want everybody seeking to solve as many problems as possible, and that's what you get in a market. That's what you get if you leave them alone. And they will do it more or less, right, depending on cultural things, how hard they work, and these other things.
Just like the central planners will.
But yes. You're right. The central planners are not above those forces either. And they'll act more or less morally depending on the culture. But again, as you're saying, that's not something you can dictate anyway. Yeah, it's an interesting problem, and it's been interesting to go back and forth on it, to be initially persuaded about the rise of China, and then to look at their economics and be like, no,
no. It's not, as someone who felt that way, absolutely, Dan, who was like, yeah, China's hybridization is working. The more I look into it, the more I say no, it's not. All that we are seeing is the fact that China is covering up their costs so that they just look rosy, which they can do because they have that control.
Yes, and in reality, what they're doing is just truly crazy amounts of malinvestment. They're spending money, resources, time, effort on things that are taking them nowhere, that are making no one's lives better.
Yeah, and you can look at the quality of life of the average person in China, and that'll give you a good idea of how well they're actually doing.
Yes, which is something that will improve across time if they just keep trading with people, right? Regardless of what they do. But if their own policies do not get in line, the rate will be slower than other nations. And it's the economic realities that these central planners inevitably run up against. That
no amount of rhetoric can get past the physical realities.
Right. And with that, thank you for listening.